These folks are living in a very harsh environment, and so these people are going to establish kind of a psychological cushion that will help them deal with this world. A lot of times they would look at the natural world as being an extension of themselves or of their families, and so they really don't divorce themselves like other cultures do from the natural world. They're all a part of it, and so there's a certain cycle of life. And when you do that, and when you begin to personify, like let's say coyote or spider grandmother woman or chipmunk, and you personify those creatures, you've brought them into your family, and now the wider world around you that for the most part can be very harsh now doesn't seem quite as harsh because you're a part of it. And if it does beat you down, it's not so much that it's punished you, but it has reminded you that perhaps maybe you need to take a little bit more caution. So coyote may say, don't do that again, and so you'll remember that. So that's how they partly get by in this environment. Now don't get me wrong, they're also very practical people, and they would use the natural environment, what nature gave them, to try to survive here. So the plants like the serviceberry here and over here, actually the berries will provide acting as an emetic to induce vomiting in case you have an upset stomach. Mountain mahogany over here would have been used to make arrow shafts. You can make a fairly decent bow out of the Utah juniper over here, something up and survive on that. Pinyon pine nut now, but the pinyon pine nut in good years will provide these people with 5,000 calories for a 1-pound bag of the pinyon pine nut. Indian rice grass, beet potato could also be used as food sources. And then for timber, Douglas fir, pinyon pine, and Utah juniper often found in the construction of their homes. And then in terms of game, mule deer, bighorn sheep, and elk, and then also smaller creatures such as chipmunks, squirrels, rabbits, both cottontail and jackrabbit. And then also too, they did domesticate dogs and turkeys. Dogs don't come so much on the table, but turkeys at some point in time do. So they would have had turkeys as well. Corn, the relative of a Mexican striped bean and also the red bean were most common, and then also a relative of the like a summer squash, like a gourd squash. And apparently they must have developed corn that could be grown within a 120 to 130 day growing season, which is a little bit better than the normal 160 to 170 days that you usually need up here. And so apparently they were able to hybridize various kinds of corn. I emphasize corn because that's what they're going to emphasize because it does not require as much water. So I imagine what they did is that they established these villages, and then, you know, they're going to follow the weather patterns. And I've been here for about 5 seasons, and precipitation is very inconsistent. On one section of the mesas, you'll have plenty of water. And then, 2-3 miles away, you'll have nothing for most of the season. And then it reverses the next year. And then the next year, it's reversed again. And so I imagine they were aware of that. And so they built mirror images of these villages so that they could pick up and move from one area that's not producing much and move to another area that is, and then move back and so on and so forth. Now, the big problem here is going to be water. Now, your crops, these are dry land farmers. They don't have any major irrigation systems. But you yourselves are going to need a water source daily. And if you don't have that, you can't live here 3 days, much less 300, 600 years. So water is the big issue, and I want to concentrate a little bit more on that because that's going to be very important as to what you can actually do here or not do on this mesa top.
Oh, there he is.
Water seeps between two geologic strata here in this part, the cliff house sandstone, so it comes through the soils above, and then it can't really penetrate the shale layer that's lying underneath it, and so it has to find an exit point, and when it does, it'll follow the contours of the rock wall and then find a natural or man-made basin upon which to lie. Now, I'm telling you right now, these seep springs, today, many of them are not, flowing very quickly. They never do anyway. Now, they have done some water studies in the past in, like the seep spring up at Balcony House, which is behind the village, which would have been important to those people, can give you upwards of 10 to 30 gallons a day. But everything still depends upon those natural flows of water, which up here can average today around anywhere from 18 inches of precipitation a year to maybe slightly over that. In the valleys below us, roughly about 14 inches. And we have found Puebloan occupation in the valleys below and on this mesa top. They're building reservoirs, of which 4 we've excavated, in catchment basins to catch water. Indicates that those natural supplies were not quite enough, and they had to augment that with some other method. And then I imagine when you get rain coming over here, and I've been here during rainstorms, that these people with this pottery that they had, some of these large water jars, I imagine they set those things out and caught that runoff, that pour off. And a lot of times your villages were going to be located near canyon heads or near these spring sources, you know, and literally the water will actually seep out of the side of the canyon. It doesn't always have to be at the head of the canyon. And there's no reason to believe, too, that these people could not have developed crude wells, much like they did in the historical period. Ranchers and farmers in this region would do the same thing. Even though the water might not be that great, it's still good enough. Now, not every spring is going to be a nice spring. A lot of times the content in here, you might have a little bit of alkaline to it, but that won't be enough to hurt you. Also, it has a little bit of a high iron taste to it. That's all right. Apparently, they must have been able to get enough water to maintain their posture here from 550 AD till around 1300 AD. So probably the weather patterns were probably a little bit average to above average.
I was trying to get ahead of you. I was hoping I had a leader and you were right there. I thought you were going to be slower. Lord, and Lord.
They tended to use a lot of juniper in enclosures because they were aware that juniper more than anything doesn't rot very easily. So they were,
You know, unaware of that apparently. So this acts as a major floor beam for a room above, and with a 4 to 6 inch mud overlay on this stuff, if you're going to build 2 and 3 and 4 story levels, if you go up to a certain level and you have a balcony that's extended out, you can actually use that as a work platform to go up to build the next level. Everything you build in here is going to be pretty well protected. You are in a rock shelter that's 280 feet across thereabouts, 40 feet in depth at its greatest depth. And then from this floor that we're on to the ceiling above, it's around 20 feet in height. So it's a little bit more compressed as opposed to Cliff Palace or Longhouse on Wetherell Mesa, which sit in very massive rock shelter openings. But they found a little niche in here, and again, one of the reasons why people are building in here is because of the spring source in the rear of the structure. Very pretty. It's called extruded method of laying that mortar mix. They put the stone on the mortar, and then as it's squeezed out, they would actually, you know, kind of pack it in, and it would overlap the stone. And so they're filling the joint, and then that joint is even more so, it's expanding out. And then in between the stone and the mortar, they put these small chips of sandstone in that mortar mix to keep that mortar mix in place. Sorry. That mortar mix in place. And the reddish coloration tells us that because there are more iron oxides in the soils up above. Iron oxides will give you red colors, and then a white or tan coloration will come from a mixture of chalk and gypsum mixed with water. And you see the line of mud mortar mix they pack in there to keep that, you don't have any cracks. So they're filling in every little crack in it. Did they enter from the side we came in? And the answer is no, never. They've walked down that pathway once they got, and then hooked up with a little ledge that actually extends right along the underneath us. And when we crawl out with someone, we're going to be on that ledge, and you'll actually follow that ledge on out. And but when they came down that toe hole trail and then walked in on that ledge, they did not come through a tunnel. They came right through a large crevice in the rock and then walked into the alcove, which was already here naturally. Now they would have had to deal with a certain amount of rubble. They would have also had to deal with a slope, and so that's why you have a retaining wall, and that's going to level off the playing field you want to build on to level off the platform, and then you start building. And the other thing is, from these rings, from the core samples in these old beams, we get tree ring dates. And those tree ring dates show two major construction phases, 1245 and 1247, and then nothing for a while, and then 1274, 1278. No in-betweens for the most part. There are a couple exceptions, but they're very small exceptions. So two major construction phases. And in the 1240s, they walked into this rock shelter, a lot of carbon black on that opposite side because your earliest construction and living took place on that side. And remember, when they first got here, they don't have any structures, so they're going to pretty much live in the back of the rock shelter and live here and work here until they get room blocks constructed. This up here, that's not carbon black, that is desert varnish, and that's natural, but this is not. Again, notice the packing of the crevice there with mud mortar mix. Notice here too, I want to point out these little pegs coming out of here. Those are called wall pegs. And a lot of times in some of these places we found little items hanging off of them. At Mug House on Wetherill Mesa, the early explorers found 3 ceramic mugs tied together with yucca fiber hanging off one of those little pegs, and that's probably what they were used for. Let me point out something else here too. There's a little stick coming out here up in the rock shelter here. These people are in a wet site, which means the alcove gets water flow coming through here. That also increases the deterioration of the rock above your head. It might be a good idea to put something like a prayer stick up there to make sure that that roof doesn't fall down on your head, and that may be one of the reasons why we see those up there. And I've seen them in other places in the park. We're seeing a narrowing of access here. In 1274 to 1278, these series of rooms from the woodcuts indicate they were later rooms, later additions. So there wasn't even a dividing wall between one side. There was no north or south side in the 1240s. And then when they do construct this wall, they leave the window here, they constructed a doorway here, then they seal it off, and then the little window that was in the doorway, they sealed that off too. Nussbaum doesn't do this in 1910, but he observes it. When you walk back behind this passageway back here, it's going to be narrow. Your eyes are going to have to adjust to the dimness there. It's going to be not totally dark. So watch your footing because the ground's uneven back there. And then you're going to step on the lower platform. Look, take a second, look behind you. You'll notice on the right-hand side carbon black coming up to a certain point, a distinct point, and then sharp demarcation line, tan line the rest of the way up, which means you're walking through a narrow passageway, yes, but the Puebloan people would have had to gone up and over an obstruction to go through that passageway, and they cannot go directly from the south courtyard to the north courtyard or vice versa because the major doorway leading from each side has been closed off and you're not going to be able to go through the window. And then, when you came up that passageway to come up into this courtyard, you notice how narrow it was to come through that hatchway. Actually, when you made the turn to your left before you stepped into the wider area here, you probably didn't notice that there were some wood beams or remnants of wood beams to the right and left around head or shoulder level. Kathleen Fierro said that actually, in addition to coming up that hatchway before you went down there or before you came up the hatchway and turned, you would have had to duck down like this, then go down to the hatchway and then go down into that farthest north courtyard. what really astounded her was that none of this is seen in the 1240s. It's all in the 1270s. And she says these people are getting in a very defensive cocoon-like posturing. They are serious about something because it's not so much access denied, but access restricted. And it really is a fascinating thing. What applies to one cliff dwelling does not apply to them all, folks. What is interesting about Balcony House is it is so much more defensive than any other site here in the park. In fact, the little ledge that you're going to crawl out through, when you get out through the tunnel, if you were able to, and I can't take people out there, but if you were able to take that tunnel or that ledge a little bit further out, about midway point between the hand and toe hole trail and the exit point through the tunnel, there's actually some rubble there sitting on the ledge that the archaeologists are almost sure that was a small defensive tower there. And it's guarding the flank of this particular village and the only approach route in. So in addition to the tunnel, you also have a tower-like structure out there. So the question is, what's happening in the 1270s that's not happening in the 1240s? And to answer that question, and to point out some other features of Balcony House, I need to take you to the other side. There's the suspense mounts. All right, carefully follow me.
Why did they build that wall to begin with?
Oh, this wall here?
The one that divided north and or the.
And the western Pueblos and the eastern Pueblos kind of have a different kind of system sometimes in terms of how the social makeup is. And in the eastern Pueblos, you find a lot more what we call moieties, which is a division in the village. And so what happens is it's basically a dual division. So in the spring and summer, you'll have a group of people taking control of civic and religious events during that time frame. And then when that time frame is done, then the winter people take over during the fall winter. Divided up the social structure of the political hierarchy. So no one group has total control. There's kind of a checks and balances. Now, whether that can be applied prehistorically, we don't know. But what is interesting is that these walls sometimes that divide villages in half, and we see it at Mung House, we see it at Spruce Tree House, Cliff Palace. Larry Norby, who did the work over there, noticed that there's 1/3 of the site divides the other 2/3 from the first third. And he finds that very interesting with some of the pueblos that he investigated. Now, whether that you can apply that to every situation here, I don't know. That may be one of the reasons why they have the dividing wall. The other is because, again, they're restricting access, free and easy access, because of the water supply back here behind the rock shelf, which you can see that before you leave. There's a large depression back there, which is with the source of that spring that they had. By the way, you're not going to find much water there, because one of the reasons why these kivas don't look quite as original, well, they aren't. They're pretty much reconstructions. Because in 1910, when Nussbaum did the excavation here, he found that they were pretty well destroyed, so he had to do a lot of rebuilding, but there was a fair amount of original still, even when he was here in 1910. In 1934, though, water seepage coming from that spring had come forward and had undermined these kivas. So in 1934, they went back in here and redid the work that Nussbaum did, and then basically did a whole reconstruction because of that water. Because that water is a serious problem here in these alcoves. And so today, you'll see off to the side of that spring, there's kind of like a square block of wood with a square cement recess underneath it. Well, there's a flow valve there that ensures that water, if it gets up to a certain level, is drawn off from the spring and taken out in the canyon below. It'll be a trickle, but that trickle over time, if you allow it to well up and come forward, it'd cause a lot of problems. It was one of the reasons, although Nussbaum doesn't mention it, it was one of the reasons why you had massive cracking in some of these walls, and also deterioration of the kiva. Well, some of the other things to point out. The beams here, the cut marks on the ends of these beams, show the striations or cut marks from stone axes, not metal tools. So they can do the analysis and make a differentiation. This is an original beam. It's been very well preserved, as many of the other beams have. And in the old photographs, it's at a tilt. Nussbaum will push it back up, and he will remortar in the wall socket there, where it's coming out from. Now, a lot of times, you'll see a lot of Portland cement, obviously, because they knew that these places would get a lot of impact from many feet coming through these areas. So this was the only stabilization material they had to use back in those days. So you see it heavily. The problem with Portland cement is it's harder than the surrounding stone it's protecting. And it's going to cause water to well up in that area around the cement, and then ultimately it's going to erode the areas around it, which is you want to preserve. Today we use more synthetic materials. The other thing, too, is that the old-timers did try to reconstitute ancient mortar. The trouble is that they're digging into fill, and they're mixing that with water, but there's a lot of grit and debris in that mud mortar mix, so it doesn't look quite as refined as what the original is, and sometimes you can tell the differences. So you'll see a lot of that, folks. And this outer area was heavily damaged from rockfall when Nussbaum came up here in 1910. By the way, he did not reconstruct the wall on this side because there was no wall to reconstruct or to restore. Either it wasn't here, or if it was here, it's possible that maybe it wasn't because it would have obstructed the flow of airflow coming across this chamber that has to be picked up by that ventilation shaft there to provide airflow as it comes down to the chamber and out the large opening in the side of the kiva wall. By the process of convection, these all would have had roofs on them, and so that airflow comes drawn up through the hatchway in the center here. These are the kivas. These are the ceremonial rooms. They're special rooms. Pueblo people normally conduct religious ceremonies, although they could also have been used as social gathering areas. They could have been used as society meeting areas, such as a warrior or hunting society, weaving society. We don't know everything prehistorically that would have been that they would have used these chambers for. You know, let's be honest. Not everything that you see today or historically in the Pueblos would have necessarily been conducted the same way here prehistorically. How in the world are we going to know? There are some features. The kivas themselves are very similar to the kivas you see in Pueblos today. Your sipapus right here are interpreted as being the spirit holes, the hole of emergence, the hole of creation hole, where the people believe that they emerged through a hole in the earth somewhere geographically. Well, the kivas also, too, are constructed by digging into the fill and then building back up. And we think that one of the reasons why they're doing that is because, in essence, what they've done is they've recreated that creation story. Traditionally, the creation story tells about how these people emerged through a series of worlds, the first, second, third, and fourth world, the fourth being the present world. The kiva floor then represents the first world your people traveled through. The second world is represented by the bench that the columns are sitting on that are holding up the roof of this structure. When you climb up that ladder to get out of this thing, some of the Pueblo beliefs believe that you emerged through you climbed up bunched grass or a reed pole. When you climb up the ladder, you're recreating that part of the story. And then when you're climbing up through the roof section here, that's the roof of the third world. And when you come up in this courtyard complex, voila, you're in the fourth and present world. In reverse then, when an individual dies, their spirit goes back through the series of worlds, and now that spirit, that departed loved one, their spirit becomes an intermediary or go-between between the living and the gods above. The mortal remains stay here. Balcony House, there were no remains found. Probably, we checked below this area, we found no evidence of human remains. Had they just tossed them over the side, yes, it's possible, but for the most part, if there's any kind of consistency in Pueblo burial practices at this time, we have found a number of things. Either the bodies were buried carefully in slopes, they don't have a slope, but when you did, in slopes in the ground in the front of your village, in open areas in the back of your rock shelters, because sometimes you don't always have building material occupying all the spaces back here. We also found bodies in oval pits, in-room blocks, maybe about 4 feet in the ground with a series of wood poles, kind of like in a tic-tac-toe fashion, over the body with a matting of turkey feather, yucca fiber, and rabbit fur kind of like a blanket over the body, over the pole structure, and then earth on top of that, and the room block might be sealed up as a tomb. And then also, in at least a couple of the village sites, at Cliff Palace and Spruce Tree House, a fair amount of calcined bone and ash was indicated, which indicates cremation had occurred. And maybe one of the reasons why we've only found 400 plus human remains here. There should have probably been more in a time period between the mid-500s up until 1300, so that could be an explanation. And again, with human remains, you never know, especially if they were put in the ground, how much rodent infestation has gotten to some of that stuff, and you know, none of it all would survive. You know, we're lucky to have what we've had and to examine it. Now, if you look in this room block, you'll notice that there's a lot of carbon black there. That's really neat because if you look up at that ceiling above there, all that smoke blackening has been caught by that understory, and that's original wood fabric in there. Notice this room block in the far corner. That's not plaster. That's oxidation from fire, and it's the only indication of intense burning here. Carbon black, that's normal from cooking fires and so on and so forth, heating fires. But that room block, to get that reddish coloration, was extremely hot, and there are charred timbers up at the top, and yet it's contained in that one room block and that one room block only. You would think if there was a major conflagration that it would have gone through the whole area. Now, somebody had said maybe it was a cremation room. Well, that's not a half bad idea. The only problem is we didn't find any evidence of any cremation in there. And you would have probably figured you would have found something like that. It's possible, too, that they burnt the room on purpose. Some native groups will choose a room block to, like if they leave an area, they will say, okay, we're never going to come back here again, and they will choose one particular point in their village that will be an indicator that they're never going to return. And that may be what we're seeing. We're kind of making a comparison with other cultures who've done similar things like that. But that's kind of a reach. And maybe they simply had an accident in that room and it got real hot because a lot of material was in there to burn and it stayed in that room and it didn't really spread out. So there's that possibility too. Pin light is shown on a little handprint. And that's there.
Once you see it, just stand right out.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I see it now.
Wow, cool. Jim and her. Look at this. Hey, you get all the picture of all the windows.
Yeah, I took a picture of all four.
There.
Then 1, 2, 3.
No, we cannot. There you go, show. You guys wanna go?
Come here.
Watch where you walking. We're gonna go see him.
You might have to top of it, and somehow you just start talking yourself out too. And then all that
Going up the ladder.
all you ever.
I bet you that root's been there for a long time.
things the way they want.
Really high height.
Not even the size of balcony house, much less cliff palace. And they're really not that hard to get into. Over 90% of them. And you would think that you would find more consistency in defensive posturing akin to balcony house all across the board if they're all afraid of something. Why aren't they?